Let's start by looking at ExpandoObject. ExpandoObject is fun to use because once you create an instance of a new ExpandoObject, which is in the system.dynamic namespace, by the way, then you have the ability to just arbitrarily add things into the object. For instance, I could give this Expando a name property just by saying .name equals Scott. I could do the same thing with methods. I could make it appear as if there is a method called speak here. What I'll just do is create a new action. You might remember those from our link module. Inside of here, I could just have a lambda expression that's going to execute if someone invokes speak. So I could say when someone invokes speak, let's just write out expando.name. And now let's run this. You can see I do get some IntelliSense here, but that's just Visual Studio ReSharper figuring out what I've placed into the Expando in this scope, but everything is resolved at runtime. And if we run this from the command line, you can see it print out the name Scott, just like we expect. In many ways, the Expando is like a dictionary of string and object. You can think of it that way. This is literally putting an entry into the dictionary. And let me use this syntax. And that looks more like we're indexing into a dictionary. But with Expando, instead of using the square braces, we can just say expando.name equals Scott, and that has the same effect. In fact, the Expando really is like a dictionary of string and object. If I press F12 to go to the metadata definition for it, you can see that it implements iDictionary of string and object. It also implements iEnumerable of key value pairs, meaning I can pull out what is inside of the Expando object. Let's try that real quick. I'm going to do a for each, and let's do for each member that is inside the Expando. That'll give me back a sequence of key value pairs. So I should be able to write out member.key. Member, by the way, is typed dynamically because it's coming out of a dynamic variable. And let's build this application and run it. And there you can see that I have added two members to the Expando, name and speak. Now that we know a little bit about ExpandoObject, let's take a look at a practical use case for Expando. What we need to do is parse this employees.xml file and pull out the first name of each employee that we find inside. There's a couple ways to do this, and one way to do this is with the types that are in the system.xml.link namespace, like xdocument. Xdocument can load up employees.xml, then we can set up a for each loop that goes through the employee elements that are inside of the root employees element, and for each one that we find, we dig out the first name element and write out the value that we find there. Relatively simple code, but it is a little bit cluttered. Let's see what this would look like with an ExpandoObject. What I'll do is instantiate doc2, and that's still going to load employees.xml, but I'm going to call a little extension method that I've written that we'll look at the source code to in just a minute. It's called asExpando. It basically takes an X document, all of the elements inside, and builds up an object graph of Expando objects. So if you have elements nested inside of elements, you'll have Expando objects nested inside of Expando objects, and you can get to those Expando objects by name. So I should be able to do something like .employee.firstname in order to get to the first name of an employee. So let's try this. Let's do a for each loop now against this Expando object in XML, and I'll say for each employee that you find inside of doc2.employees, that will give me back each employee element that's inside of the XML. Then let's write out employee.firstname. So I'm no longer indexing into an element collection or looking for an element by name like first name. Instead, all of that has been loaded as properties into an Expando object for me, so I should just be able to loop through the elements that are in the root collection, pull out the first name property on each element. Let's do a build and run this quickly. And you can see that both implementations of this program printed out Scott through Nahir. So both of our loops were able to successfully process the XML, and you can just compare the syntax here. Is it nicer to do element.element firstname.value, or would you rather just do employee.firstname? I like employee.firstname myself. And the way this happens is through this extension method. Remember, we talked about extension methods in the last module. It's called asExpando. It's a static method on a static class. It extends xdocument, and it basically looks at the root element of that document and creates an expando object. Create expando is a recursive function that calls itself to keep building up expandos from this nested XML. We're basically creating expando objects, treating them as dictionaries. We've seen how they really are just dictionaries behind the scenes. If that particular element that we're on has any child elements, then we're going to create a new list of expando objects to collect all the children that are inside of that element. Otherwise, if we have an element that doesn't have any additional child elements, it's a leaf element, what we'll do is take the name of that element and add it into the expando object. That gives us the ability to do employee.firstname, and then the value for that particular property will be the value inside of that element. So just a little bit of code here transforms all of our XML into expando objects that make the API a little bit easier on the eyes.